Good Fach. The Rebbe began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is Shabbos Parshas Emor, and together with it we have just passed Pesach Sheni a few days ago, which was the 14th day of Iyar, yesterday, as well that we are several days before Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer, which will be falling out on Tuesday, the 18th in the month of Iyar. And as we know, the Gemara tells us, Benegei Havdalah, that the first part of the week, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, have a special shaychus to Shabbos, to the Shabbos before. So though we know that the entire week gets bracha from Shabbos, as the famous expression quoted often, Shabbos, minei mizbochen kula yomin, all the days of the week receive bracha from Shabbos, still in all, the first 3 days of the week have a much stronger shaychus to Shabbos. So the Shabbos that we are in right now has a very strong shaychus to the day of Lag BaOmer, which will be falling out on this coming Tuesday. So we must say that the inyanim which are involved in today's Shabbos are many inyanim. There's the inyan, firstly, that it's Shabbos Parshas Emor. Together with it, we have just celebrated Pesach Sheni, so that means this Shabbos has a shaychus to Pesach Sheni as well, and it also has a shaychus to Lag BaOmer, which is going to come. And as we find, the Gemara tells us that Benegeya, the weight one person can pick up, Gemara says that when two people get together and try to pick up an amount of weight, it is not just that they could pick up double the amount of what one person can pick up, but they can pick up much more than the one person was able to pick up on his own. The same, the Rebbe says, when several inyanim get together, the Pshat is that each one of the inyanim give us an extra amount of chizuk, an extra amount of strength into the other inyanim. So all of these inyanim, when they are tied in together, are extremely strong and are of great significance and meaning, and we can take a very strong hayra lesson from all of these inyanim. Firstly, it is Parshas Emor. The Sedra in general is called Emor, though there are many inyanim which are discussed in the Sedra. Still, when one wants to refer to any of the many inyanim which are discussed in the Sedra, he still refers to it by Parshas Emor. It is still the very same Emor for all the inyanim, the same title for all the inyanim which are discussed in the Sedra. What is the meaning of Emor? Meaning of Emor is to tell, zu sagen. What's the pshat? Amira, Emor. So the Rebbe is teaching. We know there are inyanim which remain in thought, machshava, and there's an inyan of amira, of dibur. That means when one relates to another. What are we commanded? What are we instructed here in the Hira that we are to take from Parshas Emor? That we are to be Emor. Our inyan is to say, to relate to others. This is our obligation, that Benegei, all in Yonim of Torah and all in Yonim of Kedusha, we have to share everything with another Yid in a format of Emor, especially based on the strong philosophy of Avas Yisrael, that all in Yonim of a Yid have to be penetrated with Avas Yisrael. So here we are told, Emor, we have to keep on saying constantly, we have to keep on sharing our wisdom with other people in a format of Amira. And here we see how everything is extremely accurate, the Rebbe goes on. We know that in Hebrew every expression is very exact. So the same thing, the Torah could have used an expression of Emor, and the Torah could have used another famous expression which refers to saying the word of Dibur, Daber. Still we see that for some reason, as we will see in a minute, the Rebbe chose and preferred to use the expression of Amira as opposed to the expression of Dibur. Why? Because Dibur and Amira, what is the difference between them? Amira is a lashon raka. It's a soft way of speaking. Dibur is a strong way of speaking. When one speaks very harsh and when one speaks very strong, that's when the terminology of Dibur is applicable. However, Amira shows a very soft type of a speaking. Mamela, the Rebbe goes on, in what type of way is it our inyan to address ourselves to another Yid? It's our inyan to address ourselves to a Yid in a way of Amira, not in a way of Dibur. In other words, again, based on Avas Yisrael. And when we approach another Yid, no matter what type of a position that other Yid is, here the Rebbe referred to the Alter Rebbe in Tanya. Alter Rebbe in Perek Lamed of Tanya where he discusses the idea of limud zchus, how we're supposed to look at every Yid with a right eye, and favorably, the Alter Rebbe describes that even one may be miyoshvei konos and a mechumim betivoid. Yoshvei konos means like a person who's just hanging around the streets. In other words, a person that has no advantages to himself. He's a street goer. So the Rebbe asked, what type of a limud zchus is this on a Yid? In other words, on one hand, the Alter Rebbe, is trying to tell us that we are supposed to justify the person and look at him with a right eye. Here, the Alter Rebbe himself describes the person as being a yoshvei konos and being a mechumam beteva. So the Rebbe went on explaining, being that ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba betchunya and briyosah, which means that the Rebbe never puts a person into a situation that the person shouldn't be able to handle. Any situation we are put into, the Rebbe gives us koyches to overcome the situation. So this, in fact, is part of the limud zchus that Alter Rebbe is telling us. Though this person is so and so, and this person has done such and such, still, even the person who was forced into such a position, even to this type of person, we are also supposed to look at him with a right eye. In Memela, to this type of person, we are supposed to address ourselves. And there's a constant tzivui, there's a constant commandment telling us, Emor, that we are supposed to be talking, and what type of talking? A soft way of talking, to all these type of people as well. This is the inyan that has a shayches. This is a lesson that we can take b'negei inyanim of the present and b'negei inyanim of the future. How about inyanim that have a shaychus to the past? Here we have the lesson from Pesach Sheni, which we just celebrated yesterday. What's the pshat Pesach Sheni? Pesach Sheni means that a Yid that was not in a position of being makriv the Pesach Rishon. And why was he not in the position? Because as the pasuk uses the expression, he was b'derech rechoika, he was in a distant way. And when we're talking about it in the spiritual sense, that means he was in a far distance spiritually. He had no shaychus spiritually to the Beis Hamikdash. He had no shaychus spiritually to Karbanis. Or as the pasuk gives another definition, he was tamei, he was impure. So for this type of person, there is a takana of Pesach Sheni. Comes exactly a month after Pesach. So these people who were not privileged to take part in the Pesach Rishon came to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they complained to Moshe Rabbeinu using the expression Lama Nigora. Why shall we be excluded and we shouldn't be able to take part in the Hakrav of Pesach? And that is when Moshe brought their problem to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe brought back through Moshe the message that there will be an inyan of Pesach Sheni. So b'negei Pesach Sheni, there's the famous expression from the Frierdiker Rebbe that what do we derive from Pesach Sheni? As is nishtakim farfaun. It is never too late. Even a person who, as just explained, he was impure, he was distant, and as the pasuk goes on, and the pasuk uses the expression lochem. So Chassidus teaches, what's the pshat lochem? This was by his own will, it was by his own choice that he was away, drifted away spiritually, that he wasn't makriv the Pesach Rishon. So even for this type of a person, there's also a there's also a lesson that tells us that this person as well, nishtachim farfaun, it is never too late. And as the Rebbe went on to explain that there's always within every Yid how far the Yid may seem and how far we will think the Yid is. Not just like we see by Pesach Sheni, it wasn't that Moshe Rabbeinu on his own went to these Yidden and addressed them, come and be makriv at Pesach Sheni. These Yidden had something within them that bothered them. Lama Nigora. Why should we be excluded? Why should we not have a shaychus to the Korban Pesach? So the same the Rebbe says there's within every Yid. Every Yid has within him that inner thirst, an inner will to get closer to Yiddishkeit and to have a shaychus with the Rebbe and to have a shaychus with Torah and mitzvahs. And this has to be awakened. And when this is awakened, the Yid comes out by himself. It's awakened to the extent that he comes out on his own and exclaims, Lama Nigora, why shall he be excluded and not have a shaychus to the Korban Pesach? So this is the hero which we take from the inyan of Pesach Sheni. As well, we are about to have a shaychus to Lag B'omer in a few more days. What exactly happened by Lag B'omer? So on Lag B'omer, the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara tells us, Pasku melamos, being that they weren't honoring one another, they weren't respecting one another properly. So thousands of disciples of Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara tells us 24,000 disciples of Rabbi Akiva all passed away. When? Between the days of Pesach and Lag B'Omer. However, when it came Lag B'Omer, Pasku Malamos, that is on the day when they stopped passing away, and that is why we celebrate Lag B'Omer. So the Rebbe asked today, Memoneshach, if we are talking about those Talmidim that, in other words, after Lag B'Omer, they were already did not deserve this penalty, so naturally they didn't deserve the penalty. That's why they didn't die after Lag B'Omer. Again, if we are talking about those that were still not honoring one another, and they still deserved the penalty, so why taka was it that those prior to Lag B'Omer were nenesh b'misa, and those after Lag B'Omer were not nenesh b'misa? What had transpired here within the day of Lag B'Omer that made this drastic change? So the Rebbe explained that the pshat of the day of Lag B'Omer is that Pasku Melamus, the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, stopped dying as of the day of Lag B'Omer, because this day of Lag B'Omer lifted them spiritually. The pshat, though that those were not honoring one another and they weren't treating one another properly, all this was going on when until Lag B'Omer. Once it came Lag B'Omer, this day made a drastic change in their reaction one to another. Memela, they stopped dishonoring one another. So that is why their attitude one to another taka also changed as a result of the day of Lag B'Omer. So that is why, as of Lag B'Omer, Pasku Malamus, that is why what brought about that as of the day of Lag B'Omer, the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva stopped passing away, and that is why we celebrate the day of Lag B'Omer. But doesn't mean that those that were unworthy, that those were... Rabbi is learning that as of Lag B'Omer, a complete different attitude, a complete change of attitude has taken place amongst the disciples of Rabbi Akiva. Together with all these inyanim, which we have Parshas HaMoyer, and we have that we have just had Pesach Sheni, and we're about to come into Lag B'Omer, today's day is also a day of special significance. What is today? Today is 15 days in the month of Iyar. What has taken place 15 days in the month of Iyar? The Rebbe says we find in Chumash. When the Yidden left Mitzrayim, what was the food that the Yidden took along with them out of Mitzrayim? They took along matzah. Baked the matzahs in Mitzrayim, and they took it along with them into the Midbar. How long did the matzahs last? It was until today. Until the 15th of Iyar. Because there's an expression somewhere in Gemara or in Medrash that the Yidden had 61 meals out of the matzah, taking into consideration of eating 2 meals a day. So they had 61 meals from the matzahs. And as of tomorrow, that is when the Rebbe created the lechem in Hashamayim, the man, and the Yidden, throughout all the years which they remained in the Midbar, were fed by the man. However, for this period of 30 days, they were able to survive on the matzah. In Chassidus, it's explained that there are 2 spiritual madreges b'negeya matzah. There's the matzah shekoidem chatzos, the matzah prior to chatzos, and the matzah of after chatzos. Meaning, on the eve of Pesach, when the Yidden celebrated the first Pesach in Mitzrayim, they were already commanded by the Rebbe that they should eat matzahs. So this is the matzah which they ate as the fulfillment of the mitzvah. The Rebbe commanded them that will come that evening. They will be prohibited to eat chametz. They will only be allowed to eat matzah. So this is the matzah shekoidem chatzos. However, Chassidus explains that the matzah shela'acha chatzos, meaning once HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed himself to the Yidden, Nigla aleihem HaKadosh Melech Malchei Amlochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvoido u'ba'atzmai. The Rebbe himself has appeared in Mitzrayim, and he is the one that has taken the Yidden, all of Klal Yisrael, out of Golus. This is already an entire different madrega of matzah. This is a level of matzah whereby we're associated with the Rebbe b'chvoido b'atzmai, with the Rebbe directly himself. The Rebbe also added on, this is what the Rebbe Marash explains in Mamorim of the Rebbe Marash. It is written that when a Yid eats matzah today on Pesach, he eats elikus. It's like he'd be eating godliness. What's the pshat? Because the eating of matzah today coincides with this level of matzah that came la'achar chatzos on the year that the Yidden left Mitzrayim. So Mamela, this is a very, very high madrege in Yidden. And as we know, the Zohar explains us b'negei matzah, that matzah is a meichel of a michladim heim nusa. And michle das vasa, it's a meichel that brings to emunah, and a meichel that brings to refuah, it brings to spiritual health as well. So all this has to do with this level of matzah that comes la'achar chatzos. B'negei the matzah, which the Yidden survived with for this entire month, until it came the 15th of Iyar, and the day afterwards when the Rebbe started bringing down the man, the Rebbe is learning that this matzah is also the matzah shalachah chatzos, this higher level of matzah which began after chatzos of the night of Pesach. Mamela, the Rebbe went on that what is demanded from us now, as the Rebbe expressed himself, when we're talking about Hasidim, about people, the way the Rebbe always speaks, he constantly keeps on referring to the Frierdiker Rebbe. But people who the Frierdiker Rebbe has put a tremendous amount of koiches into, and the Rebbe wanted to see very satisfactory results out of these Hasidim. And together with it, they should be blessed with Bana, Chaya, Mezayne, and all their blessings, which they have currently, is also brachas which they have gotten through the Frierdiker Rebbe. As the Rebbe used the expression, through the koich of the Rebbe. But the Rebbe added on, whatever they have is still not enough, and they should be blessed with yet more in all these inyanim of Bana Chayim Zoyna. However, when we're talking to these people, the Rebbe says, and we're demanding from them that they should go out and get Yidden involved in primary importance, seeing to it that every Yid should have an Oisen Sefer Torah. And together with it, not only Oisen Sefer Torah, but all other Miftzayim as well. To see to it, Miftzah Torah, Miftzah Avas Yisrael, all the Miftzah. So Mamela, this people begin saying that Yid, who you're demanding from me to be Mekarav now, and to bring him closer to Yiddishkeit, he's extremely far. How can you demand from me to have a shaykhs to this type of a Yid? The Rebbe referred to the expression, there's an expression, al tabeit el ma'areyu. Don't look at his looks. What you have to take into consideration, that this Yid is a descendant of one of the Yid, being that the Gemara tells us that Kol Yisrael ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim heim. All of Yidden are believers and children of believers. So Mamela, this Yid as well is a child of the believer, a child of the people that have gone out of Mitzrayim, and while going out of Mitzrayim were fed with this level of matzah, which brings emunah to people and brings spiritual health to people. Mamela, we're talking about Yidden, whose great-great-grandfather had such tremendous gilu elakus of seeing the Rebishta HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvayda b'yatzbar. Excuse me, so now if the question arises that there is a demand for us to go ahead and be mekar of these Yidden, naturally it is our obligation to do so. Because as we are constantly told, al tabeit al ma'areyu, don't look at the looks of the Yid. You look at the inner look of the Yid. Give it look at it at the internal part of the Yid. And when we'll look at the Yid internally and not judge him just by his outside and by his looks, then we will take into consideration that this Yid is a ben Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yankov. This Yid is a descendant of our ancestors who have gone out of Mitzrayim, who were fed with this matzah for 30 days. And this is a matzah that elevates spiritually, because we're talking about the matzah that has an effect. What type of matzah? Not only the matzah of koydem chatzos, we're talking about the matzah shala'acha chatzos. Memela, taking all these factors into consideration, we cannot evaluate on our own and say and exclude certain Yidden and say that these Yidden I don't want to have a shaykhs to, and these Yidden I don't want to bring closer to Yiddishkeit. On the contrary, because all Yidden equally are Yisrael, Ma'aminim, B'nei Ma'aminim, children of these people who have wandered for 30 days and were fed with this level of matzah, which is a revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvayda ba'atzmo lo al yedei malach v'lo al yedei saraf, as we recite in the Haggadah, v'lo al yedei shaliach ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvayda b'atzmo. Later in the Farbrengen, as usual, the Rebbe learned the Rashi in this week's Sedra, as well as a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, and also referred to inyanim which he spoke about at previous Farbrengens, and explained it a little more in today's Farbrengen. One of the inyanim which the Rebbe spoke about, which he spoke about previously as well, is it was on Vav Iyar, 6 days in the month of Iyar, the Rebbe addressed a rally of children. And when the Rebbe spoke to the children, the Rebbe brought out the idea that being that it's Vav Iyar is 30 days before Shavuos, And if it's 30 days before Shavuos, based on what the Gemara tells us, that 30 days before a Yontif, we have to begin making proper preparations for the Yontif. Shloishim Yom Koydem Achad, the Gemara uses the expression. So the Rebbe explained at that time to the children that it's the most proper time to begin preparing oneself already to Matan Torah. The Rebbe said that question was written to him. If we look carefully, we know that there's a machlokes when the Torah was given. Whether the Torah was given on 6 days in the month of Sivan, or the Torah was given on 7 days in the month of Sivan. The halacha is that the Torah was given on 6 days in the month of Sivan. So if we accept the halacha that 6 days in the month of Sivan nitna Torah, and we figure out exactly when does the 30-day period begin, that we should have full 30 days to prepare ourselves to Matan Torah, we will realize that the preparations have to begin not on 6 days in the month of Iyar, but on 5 days in the month of Iyar. So if we begin 5 days in the month of Iyar, we have full 30 days till Matan Torah. The Rebbe says that it's very open. In the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, where the Alter Rebbe writes these halachas, if I recall correctly, the Rebbe mentioned that Siman Tov Tzadik Dalet, where the Alter Rebbe explains how, as of 30 days before Shavuos, we are supposed to begin preparing ourselves. The Alter Rebbe uses the expression that as of 5 days in the month of Sivan. If so, the question arises when the Rebbe spoke to the children. The Rebbe explained that these preparations begin not as of 5 days of the month of Sivan, but the Rebbe stressed that it's a day later, as of 6 days in the month of Sivan. The Rebbe said that he has 2 terutzim on this in. One teretz is a teretz al pi nigla, and the other one is a teretz al pi chasidus. Teretz al pi nigla is based on a Magen Avram. Magen Avram in Orach Chaim asks the question, if we go according to the opinion that bevav b'sivn, 6 days in the month of Sivan nitna Torah, that is when the Torah was given, how can we recite in davening 7 days in the month of Sivan, Zman Matan Torah Seinu? If Zman Matan Torah Seinu was already the day before? Based on this shaila, the Magen Avram goes into another inyan. He ties it in with an inyan in Yeridea as well, because we know that before Matan Torah, the Rebbe commanded the Yidden that for 3 days al tikshu alisha. So the Yeridea learns various halachas of this as well. B'negei hilchis nida, what is considered, how to calculate an oina. So if the whole arichas in the Magen Avram, the Rebbe says what the Magen Avram concludes is that lechumre, we can do it, we can accept the opinion also that the Torah was given on 7 days of Sivan as well, if it comes out to be lechumre. The Rebbe says here he was talking to children. And when you talk to children, and you want to get the children enthused on the idea that within the next month we will be celebrating the Yontif of Zman Matan Torah Seinu, the most proper way to get the children's enthusiasm and involvement in this inyan, the Tzives Hashem, is by telling them that on this day it's the beginning of a special period of preparation to Matan Torah. If the Rebbe said if he were to tell them that we are in the midst of this period, it wouldn't have that much of an effect, as opposed that we're telling the children today a new inyan is beginning. Today we are beginning an inyan of preparations for Matan Torah. So Mamela Alpi Halacha Take, the Alter Rebbe Take Paskins, based on the halacha that b'shisha b'sivn nitna Torah. When do we have shloishim yoim lifnei Matan Torah to prepare ourselves? It Taka begins a day earlier. It begins as of 5 days in the month of Sivan. However, what we wanted to accomplish here, the Rebbe goes on, is a chumrah, a new inyan, to bring about, and it's something additional, which can be considered a chumrah. We wanted to bring about, to get the children enthused on the idea of Matan Torah, and get them involved on Matan Torah, to realize that this is a day when special preparations are beginning. So the Rebbe says it's not a stira. He didn't say anything contradictory to the fact that it begins as of the 5th on Sivan. But all he's doing, according to the other mandama, and we, based on the Magen Avram, that we can't follow the other shitta when we will gain a chumrah out of it. So here in this instance, we are gaining a chumrah, which means the warmth and inspiration which the children are gaining by this. So Mamela the Rebbe says that's why he allowed himself to express himself that it is 30 days before Matan Torah, but based on this Magen Avram and going according L'chumram, but it's 30 days takanat before Vav Sivan, but it's 30 days before Zayin Sivan. This is an explanation al Pi Nigla. And the Rebbe said another explanation al Pi Chassidus can be very simple. That if we look into Chassidus and we look through the various Mamarim from the Rabbeim and so forth, we find that many Inyanim are explained al Pi Chassidus, though it is not so in accordance with Halacha. For the Rebbe brought one famous example, that there are many Rosh Hashanah Dikem Mamarim that begin with the Mishnah Shaifa Shel Rosh Hashanah Shel Yal Poshet, which is a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah that describes how a Shaifa is supposed to be. And the Rebbe says the halacha is not like that Mishnah. The halacha is that any type of shofar is kosher from any type of animal. Memela. So again, we see that there are inyanim that are explained in Chassidus, though it is not so in accordance to halacha. Memela, the Rebbe said he explained this inyan in Avodas Hashem, but b'negei la halacha, as far as the halachic exact opinion, when take do the shloshim yom lifnei achag begin before the chag of Shavuos, this take begins not on Vav Iyar, 6 days in the month of Iyar, to be exact. Al Pi Halacha Taka begins on Hey Iyar. But again, Al Pi Chassidus, it can be explained according to the Yadam and the Yomer as well, and according to the Yadam, the Halacha Taka remains that B'shishi B'sivn Nitna Torah. But being that Rabbi Yossi holds that B'zayim B'sivn Nitna Torah, so we can also explain Al Pi Chassidus and Inyan according to Rabbi Yossi, which is Taka not Al Pi Halacha, but it still can be explained that way. It's still part of Torah Elu V'elu Divrei Elokim Chai. Another inyan which the Rebbe referred to in today's Farbrengen, which had a shaykhus to an inyan which the Rebbe already explained in the Friedike Farbrengen, is Benegeya the Siyum and Tanya. The Tanya, which is being learned over the radio by Rabbi Weinberg, after 22 years of learning, made a Siyum 2 weeks ago on it. And the Farbrengen of 2 weeks ago, Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the Rebbe at length made a Siyum on the Sefer Tanya as well. Rabbi made a siyum and at the same time also made a haschala, as the custom is that whenever we conclude something, we right away begin it again. In today's Farbrengen, the Rebbe also spoke in Inyan B'negeya the siyum of the Sefer Tanya, and the Rebbe again at the same time stressed the greatness of this avenue of Afatzas HaMayonis, which is something tremendous, that at the same time, while, as the Rebbe explained, while the Inyan of Chassidus is being learned in one place, it is carried at the very same time, Rega Kememre, to thousands and thousands of people that can participate in the Shir at the same time and be part of this Shir, which this is a tremendous inyan of Afatzas HaMayonis, which as the Rebbe expressed himself, has been going on, Kenayin Hara, for over 22 years. So Bekesher to this inyan, the Rebbe again spoke about the Siyum of Tanya. In the very end of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, in Kunteres Achon, talks about Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe says that a person has to be very careful on Shabbos. Yizoher miyoid sheloi lasuach shum sicha b'teilach has v'sholem. Not to talk any extra talk on Shabbos, being that Shabbos is a very special day. And the Alter Rebbe brings here the Gemara, Kol Hashemer Shabbos ki hilchosei moichlei al kol aveinaisav. Whoever observes Shabbos properly gets forgiveness on all his aveiras. Memela, it's something of great significance. As the Alter Rebbe goes on, there's a chitzonis of Shabbos and there's a pnimius of Shabbos. Therefore, a person has to be very careful in the observance of Shabbos to such an extent that shaloi lasuach shum sicha b'teilach has v'shalom, not to talk any extra words on Shabbos. Rebbe says if we look carefully, this is a halacha in Hilchos Shabbos. Where is the Alter Rebbe? In the Shulchan Aruch, which was also edited by the Alter Rebbe, brings a halacha. But there the Alter Rebbe brings it completely different. The Alter Rebbe there says there's a pasuk, v'daber dava. Tzeicha efzecha v'daber dava. So based on this pasuk, shelo yehei dibucha shel Shabbos ki dibucha shel chayil. You talk on Shabbos shouldn't be as you talk on the Vachel. In other words, Shabbos you have to talk differently. Based on this pasuk, the Alter Rebbe says that a person should not get involved into a long lo yarich b'dvarim b'teil, not to make extensive, long conversations of dvarim b'teil on Shabbos. This is what the Alter Rebbe says where? In Shulchan Aruch. Obviously, it's pretty contradictory between the Shulchan Aruch and the Kunteres Achon. First of all, in Kontra Sachen, he does not quote that the Yisoid for this din is a pasuk. It's a pasuk in Navi, V'daber Dava, which is the basis of the halacha, and in Shulchan Aruch, and here in Kontra Sachen, the Alter Rebbe makes no mention of the pasuk. Firstly. Second of all, if the Alter Rebbe says it much differently in Kontra Sachen as he says it in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch, he says a person shouldn't get involved in a length conversation. However, in Kontra Sachen he says, Shaloi lasuach shum sicha b'teilach, and he adds on the word chas v'shalom. So here he forbids talking, any extra talk on Shabbos. Rebbe explained, in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe is approaching from a halachic point. From a halachic point of view, there's a pasuk v'daber dava. So memela, based on the pasuk v'daber dava, we learn up shelo yehei dibucha shel Shabbos ki dibucha shel chayil. How about a person who enjoys talking? His enjoyment is talking, and al pi halacha we have to. The Indian of Shabbos is einig, and al pi halacha we have to cover the needs of all these people as well. Merely, this person, the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch Taka says, if a person enjoys, if his hanoah is talking, then he's permitted some sort of a minimum type of a conversation in Dvarim B'Teil. This is from a halachic approach. However, the Alter Rebbe in Kontra Sachen is not approaching it from a halachic approach. Here already he's approaching what Chassidus is demanding from a Yid to observe Shabbos. Chassidus is demanding from a Yid, the Rebbe used the expression in Yiddish, that his tainuk should not be in plaplam. Plaplam means talking without any contents. Okay. Chassidus, right. Chassidus demands that the tainug shaholanyin of Shabbos is oinig, v'karasa Shabbos oinig, but what should be the oinig of a Yid? That he should be at such a level that he should be extremely careful, not to get involved into any sicha b'teilach chas v'shalom, but should observe the Shabbos, as the Alter Rebbe goes on, that there's a pnimius of Shabbos, and there's the chitzonius of Shabbos. Just like in every Inyan al pi Torah, as Chassidus explains, there's the pnimius and the chitzonius. The chitzonius meaning the mere halachic requirements. However, there is an inner requirement which Shabbos stands for. The pnimis HaShabbos, as the Alter Rebbe uses the expression, what is the pnimis HaShabbos? Hakavone betfilas HaShabbos, that the entire davening of Shabbos should be a completely different davening than in the weekdays. Or betalmud Torah, as well as the learning of Torah should be different. Ledafka ba'avaya echad, one should associate himself with the Rebishter, k'moshe kosev, Shabbos l'Hashem Elokecha. Shabbos is to be associated solely with the Rebishter. Here we're talking about a completely different level in Shabbos already. It's not the halachic requirement of Shabbos. This is already the Hasidic requirement of Shabbos. So, al pi halacha, this is what Alter Rebbe discusses in Shulchan Aruch. However, what the Alter Rebbe discusses in Kontra Sachen is how a person is required to observe Shabbos al pi Hasidus. The course of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe as well learned a Mishnah, Masechta Avos, and also a Rashi in this week's Sedra. Today's Perek in Pirkei Avos is Perek Revi, it's the fourth Perek. The Mishnah which the Rebbe learned in Perek Revi is as the Alter Rebbe divides the Mishnahs, the way we have it in the Siddur, it's the division of Mishnahs as the Alter Rebbe has set it up, because the Alter Rebbe made the Nusach HaTfilah, so he has well put in Mishnah, Pirkei Avos, and the dividing of the Mishnahs is according to the Nusach of the Alter Rebbe. So in this division, it comes out to be Mishnah Chaf. What is Mishnah Chaf? Elisha ben Avuya Omer. Elisha, the son of Avuya, says. Who was Elisha ben Avuya? Elisha ben Avuya we refer to in Gemara with a different description as well, Acher. What does Elisha ben Avuya say? Haloimed yeled lamahu doime. If one is taught Torah as a child, how that's very advisable and very proper. L'dyoy ksuva al niyar chodesh. It is compared as one writes with ink on new paper. However, haloimed zaken lamahu doime. When one first learns Torah at an old age, it is compared L'dyoy ksuva al nayar mochuk, as one would write with ink on an erased piece of paper. And we know if one should try writing with ink on an erased piece of paper, he's not as successful as if he would write on a new piece of paper. This is one part of Mishnah Chaf. Another part of Mishnah Chaf is the saying of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Kfar Abavli Yomer. Haloymid min aktanim lamahu daime. If one learns from youngsters, he's compared la'oichel anovim kehois v'shoyse yayim migitoy. Haloymid min askenim lamahu daime. La'oichel anovim b'shulois v'shoyse yayim yoshan. If one learns from the elder, he's compared as he's eating ripened grapes and drinking old wine. And old wine, we all know, is better than fresh wine. All one Mishnah. So here, if we look carefully, we have incorporated in one Mishnah sayings of three Tanoim. The first Tana is Elisha ben Avuya. Secondly, we have a quotation of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Kfar Abavli. And thirdly, we have a saying of Rab Meir. What does Rab Meir say? Al testakel bekankan. Don't look into the basket. Don't look on the outside of the basket, of the barrel. Ela b'mashe yesh bo. What you are really to take into consideration is what is the contents of the barrel. Yesh kankan chodosh molo yosha. You can have a new barrel that will possess a lot of old, good material, good valuables. And v'yoshan, you may have an old barrel shafilu chodosh ein bo, that is rare of any contents. Obviously, as we'll learn pshat in the Mishnah, Rab Meir is disagreeing with Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda is putting out general rules that we have to see to learn from the elder, not from the younger. Rab Meir says no, al testakel bekanka. You can never know. Sometimes somebody young, ela b'mashe yesh bo, he may be a kankan chodosh, but he still may be full of yosha. On the other hand, we may have one who can be described as a yoshan, and he's afilu chodosh ein bo. Being that all these quotations of these three Tanoim were incorporated in one Mishnah, the Rebbe says, we must say that there must be some sort of a shaykhis between the saying of all these three Tanoim. Furthermore, not only is there a shaykhis between the saying of all these three Tanoim, but we must say that the Mishnah that comes prior to this Mishnah, which is Mishnah Yotes, serves as an introduction to this Mishnah. Because everything in Torah is extremely accurate. So we must say that whatever we've learned about the Mishnah Yotes, in other words, we cannot come to Mishnah Chaf unless we've had Mishnah Yotes as an introduction. What do we have in Mishnah Yotes? Shmuel HaKotan. What does Shmuel HaKotan, the junior Shmuel, what does he say? B'nafayla yifchal tismach. When your enemy falls, don't rejoice. Ubikoshloi al yoga libecha. And when he slips, don't be joyous. Rebbe is asking, what kind of a shaykhas do these two Mishnahs have one with another? The Rebbe also raised another question, which I don't recall the answer. Elisha ben Avuya is trying to encourage a person to learn Torah. What is he telling us? Which should be very encouraging for youngsters to learn Torah. They shouldn't waste their time. They shouldn't postpone their learning Torah. One may even find halachic ways how to get out of learning Torah, claiming that he's weak and so forth. So Elisha ben Avuya says, don't waste your time. If you have an opportunity to learn while you're young, chaparayim. Because it's one is by far more successful when he learns when he's young, because it's compared to l'dyoy ksuva al nayar chodosh. The Rebbe is asking, why does he have to go ahead and say v'aloy mitzakon lamahu daime l'dyoy ksuva al nayar mochok? Why does he have to add on? First of all, we can figure it out ourselves. Secondly, why does he have to put it on the table? At times, there are elderly people who, for whatever reason, did not have an opportunity to learn while they're young, so they also want to grasp the knowledge of Torah. What we're getting out of this saying of Elisha ben Avuya is some sort of a discouragement for the elder person who's deciding to learn. If one is a little bit older and he's deciding to learn Torah, he's discouraged by the words of Elisha ben Avuya, because he's telling him, listen, you're not going to be that successful. It's compared to the writing of ink on an erased paper, which is not as nice and not as beautiful as if it would be on a new piece of paper. In order to explain this whole inyan, the Rebbe got into explaining the greatness of Elisha ben Avuya. And as the Rebbe explained, Elisha ben Avuya was an extremely great person. Just to give us a little idea, he was the Rebbe of Rab Meir. Rab Meir, who was called Rabbi Meir. Why Meir? Meir stems from the word light, Lichtigkeit. He's bringing Meir Eine Yisrael. He's bringing light to all of Klal Yisrael. How is he bringing this light? Through Torah, naturally. Gemara tells us, Lo yordu chachamim l'soif daita shel Rab Meir. The chachamim were not able to grasp and really understand the teachings and the knowledge and the wisdom of Rab Meir. This Rabbi Meir chose Elisha ben Avuya to be his Rebbe. So we must say that this Elisha ben Avuya was also really outstanding and somebody really great, that he was capable to teach Rab Meir Torah. However, as we all know, the Gemara tells us that initially Elisha ben Avuya was extremely great, to such an extent that the Gemara Masechta Chagiga describes Arba shenichnasu lepardes, that there were 4 great sages who was zeicha to go into Pardes Lamaila. Who was one of them? Elisha ben Avuya. The Rebbe said it's something very remarkable that out of the 4, it's Ben Zoyma, Ben Azai, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. In this Perek Revi, we have teachings of 3 of the 4. Except Rabbi Akiva, we have teachings here of Ben Zoyma, Ben Azai. Perek begins with Ben Zoyma, whose name was really Shimon ben Zoyma, as well as Ben Azai, and here we're talking about Elisha ben Avuya. So this in itself shows us already how great of a person Elisha ben Avuya was, that he was at a level of being one of those that should go into Pardes. However, things went wrong. The Gemara tells us in Chagiga Take that led that Elisha ben Avuya should change his complete attitude, and the Rebbe referred that there's one of the ma'ases which the Gemara tells us about Elisha ben Avuya is that he was walking in the street and he saw somebody fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKan. The Torah tells us that for the observance of Shiluach HaKan, Laman Yarichon Yamecha, one will be blessed with long life, and here he saw this person falling off the ladder and dying. So this disturbed him to such an extent, he saw something which was contradictory to what the Rebbe was promising in the Torah. All of this confused him so that he decided to select a different path. The Rebbe says there are various other stories, the incidents which he had. The Gemara tells us that he went into 13 shuls and he met children and he asked the children, Pseikli Psukach, they should tell him their pasuk. What did they learn? Until he finally heard a baskil, Shuvu bonim shevavim chutz ma'acher. Heard a baskil which calls for the return of sin children. Everyone is welcome to return except Acher. So he decided if everybody is welcome and he's not welcome, so there's no use for him to do tshuva. However, the Rebbe explained, this in itself was the avla, was the wrongdoing of Elisha ben Avuya as well. Why? There's a Gemara that tells us, Kol ma she'omer lecha bal habayis aseh, whatever, when you're a guest in someone's home, you shall follow everything what the balabas tells you to do. Chutz mitzei, if the balabas tells you to walk out, you shouldn't listen to him. The Rebbe says, naturally we are all under the leadership of the balabas of the Rabbeinu Shalayla. However, in everything we have to listen to the Rebbe. However, if one unfortunately hears this say, he hears from the Rebbe telling him go out, as the case was by Acher, what Acher heard, Shuvu bonim shevavim chutz me'acher, Acher shouldn't have accepted this. Why? Because Torah's emes, the same Torah which is emes through and through, tells us that Kol ma she'omer lecha bal habayis aseh, you are to follow chutz mitzei. So what Acher should have done was, as the expression in Tanya is, Dochak v'nichnas. He should have pushed his way through and do tshuva, and if he would do that, it would have been accepted. However, this was Acher's error, and once he heard the Shuvu Bonim Shevavim Chutz Ma'acher, he said to himself, and he said to Rabbi Meir, it seems that there is no hope for him anymore, and there's no need for him to do tshuva. However, at the same time we find that, though he himself was in such a position, he was riding on his horse on Shabbos, and Rabbi Meir was next to him, walking next to him, hearing divrei Torah from him. As the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Meir accepted the philosophy, just like one finds a good fruit, toichai ochal, kliposei zarak, the contents of the fruit you eat, however the peel you throw away. The same was Rabbi Meir's attitude to Elisha ben Avuya after Elisha ben Avuya went off the proper path. the contents of the fruit, which was still good, the Torah which he was able to gain from him, he still learned. So as they were walking, Elisha ben Avuya told Rab Meir, go back. You cannot go any further, because on Shabbos there's an inyan of Tchumim. We know Shabbos we're not allowed to go more than a certain distance on the outskirts of the city. And we have, as the Gemara uses the expression, that he was able to tell by the steps of his horse that we're already getting up to Tchum Shabbos. So therefore he's instructing his disciple Rab Meir, who he knew was doing everything accordingly al pi Torah, that Rab Meir should walk back. Rebbe was saying, on one hand we see a person who he himself did not have no belief in anything. I mean, he was under the impression of Shuvu Bonim Shevavim Chutz Ma'acher. He heard this Baskoil. He was totally convinced that there's no room for tshuva for him anymore. At the same time, he knew one of his Talmidim, Rab Meir, who was learning Torah from him. Here they are walking together on Shabbos. The Rebbe says it was not a question of a deraisa. It was not a question of a derabanan. Of a deraisa, definitely not. Of a derabanan, the Rebbe says there are various opinions how hard this inyan of the Rabbanan is and how exactly it was the area where Rab Meir was walking and Elisha ben Avuya was traveling. Still we see how concerned he was about his disciple, that knowing that it may be some sort of an issa, he was out to protect him and to see to it that Rab Meir should not be Ivan the issa. So this is what we have as an introduction, to this Mishnah. The Mishnah begins, Shmuel hakot noimer b'nefayla yifchal tismach. When your enemy falls, you shouldn't rejoice. We're learning Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is Milah de Chasidusah, which is telling us things beyond, things which we are supposed to do yet more than our own obligation, al pi Torah. So the question arises, how does a person have an enemy? There's a mitzvah of Avos Yisrael. Shmuel is telling us, when your enemy falls, don't rejoice. Who's your enemy? How does a Yid have an enemy to begin with? There's a mitzvah that we are supposed to love each and every Yid. How can we have enemies? So we must say that the Mishnah here is talking about someone who can be defined as an enemy, and it is oisgehalten, it is accurate so, al pi Torah. How can this be? So here we have to come on to what the Alter Rebbe explains us in Perek Lamed Beis of Tanya, which this is the Perek that explains the basics, how Chassidus explains the importance of Avos Yisrael. So at the very end of this Perek, in parentheses, the Alter Rebbe writes, V'lo yomar David HaMelech alav hashalom tachlis sinos aneisim. Who did David HaMelech refer to when he says, I hate them totally? Aminim v'apikosim. One who can really be defined as a mean and as an apikoires she'ein lam chelek b'lekah Yisrael. So this is someone who we may refer to as an enemy. Other than that, we cannot refer to any Yid as an oyev. No Yid is our enemy. We have to love every Yid. So when Shmuel HaKotan is telling us, b'nefoilo yifchal tismach, when your enemy falls, don't you be happy, don't rejoice. We are talking about an enemy in the spiritual sense. An enemy meaning somebody who, as the Alter Rebbe is explaining, as somebody whom we are allowed to express hatred to. Rebbe Ere the Geschmack Welt. The Alter Rebbe concludes the words in Perek Lamed Beis, Ki de'issa b'Gemara, as explained in Gemara, Reish Perek Teres Zayin de Shabbos, beginning of the 16th Perek in Shabbos. Why does the Alter Rebbe have to quote where this is said? So the Gemara tells us that on Shabbos there is no Batei Dinim. There's no Gehenim on Shabbos. However, here the Alter Rebbe says, this is something which even Masechta Shabbos, even this Masechta which sort of like does away with the whole concept of Gehenim and Batei and penalties, spiritual penalties. Even according to Masechta Shabbos, this person is also considered one who I'm allowed to express hatred to. So we can imagine how far this person went. That the Gemara says, Ein lam chelek b'lekah Yisrael, they have no chelek b'lekah Yisrael, they're totally considered mean in that because. And the Rebbe explaining this is something of the category that Elisha ben Avuya Acher fit into. So that is why, as an introduction to Mishnah Chaf, where Mishnah Chaf we hear how Elisha ben Avuya, how Acher is telling us the greatness and the importance of learning Torah. Prior to that, we have to come to an introduction in order that we should be able to learn and gain and gain knowledge and wisdom from the teachings of Elisha ben Avuya. That is why the Mishnah prior to that gives us an introduction. B'nefayla yifchal tismach. When your enemy falls, don't rejoice. Whom do we mean enemy? Somebody like Elisha ben Avuya. Because other than that, there's no union of enemies. We're supposed to love every Yid. However, somebody who has gone that far, as Hitaka did, he can be defined as a Noyef. So after having an introduction of B'nefayla yifchal tismach, of B'kosh le'al yogalabecha, pen yirashem v'rabeinu v'heishiv ma'olav apoy, here we can come to Mishnah Chaf and learn what Elisha ben Avuya is telling us, the importance and the greatness of learning Torah. And the Rebbe says we can find in Medrash and in Yerushalmi, we find that Elisha ben Avuya, his father, went really out of his way and was very, very careful that Elisha ben Avuya, while being young, should have a tremendous teaching of Torah, should gain a tremendous knowledge of Torah. So that is why it's very appropriate that Elisha ben Avuya is the one who's stressing the greatness of the learning Torah while one is young, because this is what he experienced in his life as well. And what his father taught him in his life, that it's one succeeds very much, and it's of great importance and very beneficial when one learns Torah at his early age. Rabbi added on, we also find in the Gemara, where the Gemara tells us at length the entire story of Elisha ben Avuya Avacha, we find that after Rabbi Yochanan passed away, it was a tremendous spiritual assistance for Elisha ben Avuya, to such an extent that prior to that there was smoke coming from his keva, showing how he is burning in Gehenna. After Rabbi Yochanan passed away, it stopped. What shaykhs does it have to Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi explained that the Gemara tells us, the Gemara Masechta Brachos that tells us that if a person that one sees in his dream two nuns, it shows it's a reminder of Nisei Nisei. It's explained in Hasidus also at length. The name Rabbi Yochanan is composed of two nuns, one regular nun and one lange nun. And the Rebbe says a lange nun is yet greater. It's explained in Hasidus that a lange nun has a very great inyan within itself, even more than a regular nun. Memela, that is why Rabbi Yochanan, who had these two nuns in his name, he was able to accomplish Nisei Nisim, he was able to accomplish something out of the ordinary and bring spiritual assistance to Elisha ben Avuya. In this very same Mishnah of Elisha ben Avuya, the Mishnah concludes with a saying of Rab Meir. Why? Because it's also to bring together Elisha ben Avuya and his disciple and his Talmud Rab Meir. Because Rab Meir was, as we just explained at length, Rab Meir gained a lot of knowledge B'Torah from Elisha ben Avuya. But we'll try and go through the Rashi in this week's. If I recall correctly, the Rebbe did not answer it. In Parshas Emor in this week's Sedre, Kapitel Chav Beis, Pasik Lamed Beis. Pasik is telling us, "V'loi sechalalu Hashem kachi." We shall not desecrate the Rebishter's name. V'nikdashti, the Rebishter will be sanctified. B'soich b'nei Yisrael, ani Hashem mikadishchem. If we look into Rashi, which is a relatively long Rashi, there are many questions that arise. V'loi sechalalu, Rashi comments, Laver al dvorai mezidin. We should not go ahead. What's the pshat? We shouldn't desecrate the Rebishter's name. Not to be over on the Rebishter's will intentionally. Because when one is over intentionally on the Rebishter's will, he's desecrating the holy name. Okay. Now Rashi goes weiter. Once it already says in the pasuk we shouldn't desecrate the Rebishter's name. Ma talmud loima v'nikdashti. If we look weiter on the pasuk, it says already v'lo yisechalu Hashem kachi. What is the continuation of the pasuk? V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. Misoyer atzmecha, you shall give yourself over. V'kadei shmi. In other words, a person should be ready to go on Kiddush Hashem, to give his life for the sanctification of the Rebishter's name. Yachil bi yachid. I would want to think this shall be done privately. Talmud loima b'soich b'nei Yisrael. The pasuk tells us when are we obligated to do so? Only in public. Ukshu meiser atzmai, and once a person gives his life for the Rebishter, yimser atzmai al menas lamos. He should be willing to give his life totally. Shekol ha-meiser as atzmai al menas haneis, if a person says, I'm going to be willing to give my life. Why? Because ultimately I hope that God will make a miracle and I will remain alive. No, this is not so. Ein oisin le'neis. Then the miracle will not happen. If he intends and hopes for a miracle, the miracle wouldn't happen. Shekein vatzinu b'Hananya Mishael v'Azariah. This is what we find by Hananya Mishael v'Azariah. Sheloi maschu atzman al menas haneis. When they gave their lives, they were willing to give their lives for the Rebishter. They did not hope for a miracle. And he quotes a pasuk in Daniel that they didn't care matzil v'lo matzil. They were, whether he would rescue or not rescue, they were willing to give their lives. And that is why they were saved. However, if they would be waiting for miracles, no miracle would be coming. Rebbe said, actually, it's a very long Rashi, and what Rashi is really doing is he's explaining the whole pasuk. So if Rashi is explaining the whole pasuk, Rashi should quote in the words of V'lo Yisachalalu, not just the beginning of the pasuk of V'lo Yisachalalu. This requires a quotation, as we know the Rebbe always learns, that Rashi quotes the words that he's mafarish. Then Rashi should also quote the other words which he's explaining as well. So the Rebbe is learning Enochaname. When Rashi is bringing the words V'niktashti, we have to imagine as if the V'niktashti would also be in big caps, like the beginning of the Rashi. Also, the Rebbe said, if we look into Mechilta, where Rashi is taken from, we find another story. In Mechilta, we find a story that some Roman emperor met two Jewish people, two brothers, if I recall correctly. And he met them in a dangerous area, and he told them, well, you are descendants of the nation of Hananya, Mishael, v'Azariah, who we're just talking about. Will God perform the same type of miracle to you as He's performed to Hananya, Mishael, v'Azariah? So they responded to this Roman dictator, first of all, we don't know if we are worthy of Nisim, like Hananya, Mishael, v'Azariah were. Perhaps we are worthy to be punished. We deserve Misa, and that's why the Rebishter will give us Misa, because we have sinned somewhere, and the Rebishter is going to bring about to us an union of Misa. Secondly, they told them, you are not as chashiv as Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was worthy that a Nesh should be brought about through him. However, you are not. And Mechilta feels like the story that this Roman leader at the very end passed away in an extremely painful way. The source of this Rashi is the Mechilta. Excuse me. What happened to them?
Yeah.
They were also killed. The source of this Rashi is the Mechilta. So if Rashi is quoting from the Mechilta Mainzer, the case of Hananya, Mishael, v'Azariah, why doesn't Rashi quote the other case as well? Another question which the Rebbe asked. Briefly, what the Rebbe is learning Pshat in this Rashi. Prior to that, we learned the pasuk. Ushmartem mitzvoisai v'asisa moisam ani Hashem. Then the pasuk is going on, v'lo yisachalalu Hashem kochi. So v'lo yisachalalu, Rashi is telling us means lave al dvarai mizidim. In other words, when a yid is over and an avera b'mezid, besides doing the crime intentionally, besides the specific crime that he's just committed, he's committed an additional crime. He was over on this pasuk. There's a pasuk here that tells us v'lo yisachalalu Hashem kochi, and he was mechalal Hashem kochi, because the Rebishter tells us that we're not allowed to do this, and he did this. Now Rashi asks, the pasuk already says v'lo yisachalalu Hashem kochi. What's the pshat weiter on the pasuk? V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. Ma talmud loyma v'nikdashti misoyer atzmecha v'kadishmi. So here we're coming into another inyan. There's an inyan of Kiddush Hashem. There's an inyan of Kiddush Hashem, which this has to do with only three inyanim: Gilu Aroyes, Avodah Zarah, and Shvichas Dam. Which obviously the pasuk till here was not talking about it, because the pasuk uses the expression Shmartem mitzvoisai v'asisa moisam. The pasuk is talking about mitzvahs in general. V'lo yisachalalu Hashem kochi. Rashi learned already pshat is referring to being goyvan and avera b'mezid. What's the pshat v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael? So Rashi is introducing that the pasuk here is talking about something additional. That the pasuk here is telling us that there are three areas: Gilu Arayis, Avodah Zarah, Shvichas Damim, that require Kiddush Hashem. So this is what the pasuk here is talking about. The Rebbe raised another question. Why doesn't Rashi mention something which is very popular to all children that have learned Chumash? What has taken place with Avram and Haran. Avram was thrown into the Kivshan Aish, was thrown into the fire, and Avram came out lebedik. However, Haran, Medrash tells us, did not come out alive. So here we have an obvious case that can be explained to the child very simple. Avram came out alive. Why? Because he was willing to go on Kiddush Hashem and did not take in consideration whether the Rebbeinu would perform miracles or wouldn't. That's why the Rebbeinu saved his life. However, Haran, who went into the Kivshan Aish, but was hoping that the only way he's going into the Kivshan Aish is that the Rebbeinu would perform a miracle. That is why he did not come out alive. Why doesn't Rashi bring this example, which is something which is known to every child that's learning Chumash? Every child learned Bereshis and all the stories around Bereshis. So Mamela, this story is familiar to all the children. So Rebbe said simply two reasons. First of all, Rashi is learning Pshat, that when is this inyan of Kiddush Hashem? B'soich b'nei Yisrael. It has to be done b'soich b'nei Yisrael. B'soich b'nei Yisrael means it has to be publicly. However, if it's done in privacy, how Rashi is learning Pshat in the Pasuk, this inyan does not apply. By Avram and Haran, there was no concept of B'soich b'nei Yisrael. First of all, it was an Ur Kasdim. There was no Soich b'nei Yisrael. If we say it shouldn't, if we're excluding privacy, that means it has to have at least a minyan. At least some sort of a publicity, publicly. This is something which by Avram and Haran did not exist. There was no inyan of minyan there. There was no concept of Bnei Yisrael as yet. There was no inyan of Jews bichlal to begin with. This is something the Jewish nation came later. And also it was privately. So Mamela, Rashi cannot refer to that Maaseh at all. So that is why Rashi refers to the Maaseh of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. What does Rashi want to prove from Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah? Shekola Moiser Atzmai al Menas Haneis Ein Oisen Lo Neis. Shekein Matzinu b'Hanani Mishael v'Azariah. What do we find by Hanani Mishael v'Azariah? Shaloi Maschu Atzman al Menas Haneis. So what Rashi is out to bring is that we find by Hanani Mishael v'Azariah that they were ready to give their lives and were not looking for the Rebbe to perform a nes. And this we find very obvious in the incident of Hanani Mishael v'Azariah. Talking about this inyan of B'soich b'nei Yisrael, which means the importance of public and so forth, the Rebbe also referred to the inyan of Beroiv Am Hadras Melech, that Benegei mitzvahs we find in Shulchan Aruch that when mitzvahs are performed publicly, it brings hodor, it brings beauty and glory to the Melech Melech HaMelech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe alerted that this Tuesday we will have the siyum of the second Sefer Torah, which was written by Yeshivas Temchet Mimim. Tuesday will be the siyum of the Sefer Torah on Lag Ba'ima, as well as the beginning of the writing of the new Sefer Torah. So Rebbe stressed that it's extremely important to see to it that everyone participates in this siyum of the Sefer Torah, because this is an inyan of Roiv Am Hadras Melech. It's something the more that will attend will add more glory to the inyan, especially based that we know that the Emor tells us, Chazal tells us, Ma'at oyer doicha har b'choshech. A little bit of light pushes away a lot of darkness. How much more so when we're not talking about a little bit of light, but when we're talking about a lot of light, which is brought about the completion of a Sefer Torah, which was written for the unity of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe urged that it's extremely important that everybody should take part and participate in the Siyum Sefer Torah. As well, towards the end of the Farbrengen as well, the Rebbe also asked that wherever possible to see to it that in addition to the Siyum Sefer Torah and in other parts of the world as well, to see to it that groups, kinusim, people should congregate on this day of Lag Ba'ima. Adults, and most particularly children, Tzivos Hashem, should congregate, should get together and have gatherings and rallies on this day of Lag Ba'ima. And the Rebbe also suggested that the most appropriate inyanim to talk about at these kinusim, at these gatherings, at these farbrengens and rallies is to bring about the dearness and the great love of Torah as we find it in the life of Rab Shimon ben Yochai. As the Gemara tells us that Rab Shimon ben Yochai was a person who could be categorized as Teirosai Nasai. His occupation was solely the learning of Torah. So from here we can gain to bring about, to stress to all participants in these kinusim the greatness of Torah and the love for Torah which each and every Yid should have, as well as another union which is of extreme importance to bring out at these kinusim is the idea of Avas Yisrael, which is something which is very open in its shaychus to Lag Ba'ima, the story of the disciples of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva and his disciples, whereby we find how great and important the inyan of Avas Yisrael is. So the Rebbe again alerted very strongly to see to it that these inyanim should take place on the day of Lag BaOmer, and to see that these inyanim, it's suggested and advisable that these inyanim should be discussed at all the Lag BaOmer rallies.